Hi, everyone. Welcome to the January 17th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to handicap some races upcoming this weekend at the Fairgrounds, Tampa Bay Downs, and Aqueduct. The major focus, though, is at the Fairgrounds, where they're running one of the first major Derby preps, that being the Lecomte Stakes, a Grade 3 event that's offering 10 points towards the winner, qualifying towards the Kentucky Derby. Always exciting when these Derby preps get underway, and I think we'll start with the Lecomte. And Craig, there's a lot to talk about in this race because it drew a 14-horse field. We'll see if they all run. It sounds like one of them's actually going to exit and run in the Southwest at Oaklawn, or the Smarty Jones rather, at Oaklawn instead. But this is a pretty competitive field.
It is. As you say, I was just reading an article by Mary Rampolini, our colleague, mentioning Lynn's map drew into the Smarty Jones, I think it is, in the 8 post. So I would imagine they'll prefer that to the 14, but it didn't sound like an official decision was made. I wasn't a big fan of that horse given the outside, so I still think it's a great betting race. We do have to monitor who's going to show up with the other alternatives. As expected, the pace projector thinks this is going to be a fast-paced race. I don't think that will change if Lynn's map does in fact defect from the race. It shows Sycamore Road on a clear lead. He's also drawn way outside, so I would imagine the tactics are going to dictate he kind of has to go or else he's going to be in trouble. But just looking at the race and looking over the field and knowing what I know about these horses, I do think Scabbard is clearly the horse to beat in here. Curious what you think about it.
Yeah, I think Scabbard is definitely the center of this race, just given his general class edge over this field. He ran against some of the top 2-year-olds that we saw last year in the Saratoga Special, as well as in the Iroquois, where he put forth his best performance when he was second to Dennis's Moment, who didn't show up in the Breeders' Cup with a bad trip, but I think people still respect Dennis's Moment as being one of the best 2-year-olds that we saw last year. So I feel like Scabbard's going to be tough in this race if he gets back to that Iroquois performance, because that 109 TimeformUS speed figure that he earned that day really does make him the horse to beat here. You just have to decide for yourself, do you want to make an excuse for his non-effort in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile? I say non-effort. He finished 4th that day, but that was a race with a lot of no-shows, and it felt like, given the fact that 8 Rings didn't show up, given the fact that Dennis's Moment had a poor trip, the door was kind of open for Scabbard to walk through, and he wasn't able to. Was it the track surface? Was it the kickback that worked against him? It was a race where nobody really closed. Just given how competitive this field is, 13 horses, he's got to work out a trip. I generally don't want to take a favorite, but I'm not going to toss him by any means. I think he's a horse you have to use.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do give him a bit of an excuse for that Breeders' Cup. He was inside the whole way where he wasn't really the place to be. The other 2 horses I really had an opinion on. The first one is I'm against Mr. Monomoy. If this wasn't Monomoy's girl's little brother, I doubt anybody would really be talking about him. He hasn't run particularly fast in his couple of outings. He was run down by Lynn's map, who we talked about earlier, even though that one was at a bit of a pace disadvantage last time. So I'm not saying he can't win, but he's almost certainly going to be over betting here. The one horse at a price that I do like some is Finnick the Fierce, who draws inside. Anywhere near that 15-1 morning line, I think is going to offer good value, even a bit less than that for me. He's improving. I liked his closing kick last time in the slop in a race that didn't have a whole lot of pace, and I just think he's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there are a lot of horses to talk about. Speaking of Finnick the Fierce, since you just ended with him, he does seem like a horse that really improved with a stretch out in distance last time. I know the temptation for some might be that to say that he's a sloppy track freak and he just improved in the sloppy track at the Kentucky Jockey Club last time. But watching that race and watching his earlier races, to me, it feels like he's just a horse that wanted to go the 2 turns all along, and he got to do that last time. He was 87-1 that day. You're not going to get that kind of price here. But as you said, he's 15-1 in the morning line. So it feels like he is going to be somewhere in the double-digit odds range once again. So I can't really fault him. And with the TimeformUS pace projector being the way it is, predicting a fast pace, he might work out the right trip. I totally agree with your take on Mr. Monomoy. I wasn't thrilled with his maiden victory 2-back because when you look through that field, he just wasn't beating a whole lot that day, even though he did it from a visual standpoint, he did it impressively. His last race in the slop at the fairgrounds, I thought he had no excuse to lose. As you were saying, the pace figures for that race are color-coded blue. It was a slow pace, and he just had that advantage coming to the 16th pole and got cut down by Lynn's Map. I am a little disappointed that Lynn's Map is probably not participating in this race because while the post position certainly wasn't ideal, I like all of Lynn's Map's races. I think he's really heading in the right direction. I liked his maiden win 2 back at Churchill Downs. I love the way that he came and got Mr. Monomoy last time, even though he was against the pace situation that day. Just seems like a really athletic horse who's improving with added distance. I'll look for him in the Smarty Jones because that seems like it's going to be a smaller field, but he's a horse that I do think has ability. Others to talk about, you've got some others coming out of the Kentucky Jockey Club. Enforceable, Mark Cassidy's other horse, was just sort of picking up pieces coming on too late that day. I want a different horse, a different lightly raced horse in particular, that being Silver State for Steve Asmussen. We'll see what price he's going to be. He's 5-1 on the morning line. I could see this one taking a little bit of action, although he's not going to be favored. I do think Scabbard's going to be favored in this race. But Silver State has just been in 2 really tough fights in both of his races. He dead heated for the victory first time out at Churchill Downs. The co-winner of that race, Relentless Dancer, got a very good trip that day, whereas Silver State broke slowly, actually breaking last in an 11-horse field, had to rush up along the backstretch, continue to make a sustained move around the far turn, thought he was really game to finish in a photo that day. And then last time out, I thought it was no disgrace losing to a horse like Necker Island, who's shown a lot of promise. Again, he rated kindly that day, bowled his way through, looked like he was briefly going to get there, but it's not like he hung on the money. I mean, he was really trying to get that horse at the end, just lost a really close bob. Doesn't seem like one that's going to have much trouble at the distance. He's got Empire Maker on the dam side. The second dam's actually a full sister to Kentucky Derby winner Monarchos. So he's got all the classic bloodlines. He's shown promise, and I just think he could work out the right trip in this race.
Yeah, I have no problem with him. Steve Asmussen's always going to be dangerous. He's got his top rider. Nothing wrong at all. He's moving in the right direction, so I could see him. I suspect he'll be quite a bit, maybe not quite a bit lower, but I'd expect him in about the 7-2 range in this race. I don't think he'll get the 5-1, but that could very well offer value. Well, just got to kind of monitor it and just make sure you form your opinions, not you personally, but our listeners out there, make sure your opinions match what you're betting at the window when you look at those odds.
Yeah, totally. And I did a longer segment on this race on the DRF video page earlier this week where I think I said I would take about 4-1 on Silver State. I think that's a fair price, and hopefully we get that. Before we move on, I just want to briefly touch upon the horse that you kind of started with, Sycamore Run, who's projected to be out on the front end of this race. What do you do with a horse like this? Because he's got actually the highest last out TimeformUS speed figure in this field when he got that 105 in his debut. It's just a big ask for him to stretch out in distance like this.
It is. He just has so much going against him, and it's not like he's going to be, 15-1. He's going to take money. He won over a sloppy track with a clear lead the whole way around. Now he draws outside, try in 2 turns. It's just not the kind of horse that's ever going to interest me at the betting window at this kind of price.
Yeah, I feel pretty much the same way about him. Let's move on to a couple of other stakes races for the older horses earlier in the card at the fairgrounds. And we can kind of just seamlessly go from one to the other because there are quite a few cross entries in these 2 races. One's on the dirt, one's on the turf. I think a lot of people were thinking in case they get rain at the fairgrounds, they just want to wind up in the easier spots, so they'll enter in both of them. Let's begin with the dirt race, the Louisiana Stakes, the 10th race on the card, grade 3 event, a mile and a 16th on the dirt course. And assuming that this field stays intact and the other race we're going to talk about does stay on the turf, seems like Silver Dust is probably the horse to beat. He was in great form in these series of stakes races at the fairgrounds last winter, coming off a bit of a layoff here, but his form is just rock solid.
It is. Before I start on the race, I do want to mention, I imagine a lot of these did it because the purse of the turf race is $50,000 higher. So it just said it might not only be an easier spot, but for more money as well. So it would be interesting. I imagine if it rained, it would be quite the chess game deciding who's going to stay, who's going to move. But for the purposes of this show, we'll stick with it not raining. Last I checked, it was about a 50% chance. Maybe they would stay on the turf anyway for a day like this. Let's hope so. I'm totally with you on Silver Dust. He's clearly the horse to beat, in my opinion. He's the morning line favorite, I think. He's proven at the fairgrounds. He wins this share of races. This is a race where the pace projector doesn't think there's going to be a whole lot of speed, and I tend to agree with that. And for that reason, I'm actually leaning a little towards Gunnett from a value perspective. He's another Steve Asmussen trained horse. He's a very young 4-year-old. He was a May foal, I believe. So he's still basically a 3-year-old who's improving every time out. He ran into very good Warriors Charge last time, a horse who ran a very respectable fourth in the Preakness last year, I believe, in his last start before he came back. It was a race with very little pace. I'm not sure what was going on there, but they just kind of let Warriors Charge have his own way. But he hung right with them, was only beaten 2 lengths, and I don't think it's going to take a huge step forward for Gunnett to be a competitor with the older group in this field.
Yeah, I agree about Silver Dust. I think he's the horse to beat. He's not going to offer a ton of value because he is likely to be the favorite in this race, but I really have no knocks against him. I'm of two minds about Gunnett. On one hand, I acknowledge he did show a lot of promise last year, and I agree with you that I was a little puzzled by the tactics last time because it seemed like he could have been the speed or he could have been right on top of Warriors Charge in that race, but they were really intent on reining him off the pace and getting him in behind that horse early or stalking more than a length behind him. It seemed like Gunnett resented that restraint a little bit towards the beginning of the race, but he got on even terms with Warriors Charge at the top of the stretch, and that horse just turned him away. I didn't like that Gunnett never changed leads in the stretch, and that's not something you want to see, especially at a track like the Fairgrounds where the stretch is so long. You want to see these horses have more professional leads changes, but it is just his 8th career start, so he might be more professional in this race. He's definitely one I would use given that pace situation. The horse that I actually would put on top here, just hoping to get a little bit of value, is a horse that I've never really liked before, but Kukulkan, he ran really well, surprisingly well in some races last summer. Actually was in a close decision with Silver Dust when they ran in that West Virginia Governor Stakes back in August. And he made the first move that day into an honest enough pace, and Silver Dust just came and got him. He did finish far behind Silver Dust when they met again in the Lucas Classic in September, but I thought they made a bit of a tactical error with Kukulkan that day because they took him way off the pace, and that was just not a race that favored closers whatsoever. It was really dominated towards the front end, and he was just never in the hunt that day. I don't care about the speed figure that he ran in that race last time on that Classico del Caribe card at Gulfstream because he won so easily and it was just an uncompetitive affair. But he's got past speed figures that put him squarely in the mix, and he's going to be a much better price than Silver Dust.
Yeah, and for the record, those speed figures are very tough to make. They ran some of the races were normal races earlier on the card. For the races later on the card, the stakes races, there was very little to go on. So you can, I don't remember it being overly difficult, like everything seemed to line up, but I would still take that 109 with a grain of salt. It was at the distance, 1.25 miles that they almost never run at Gulfstream. I couldn't remember the last time they did run it before that one. So I don't really have any knocks on him either. I think we're both just looking to find somebody that can beat Silver Dust while acknowledging he is the horse to beat.
And let's transition right into that turf. Comes one race later, the Colonel Bradley, as you mentioned, a slightly higher purse for this race. It's going about 1.16 miles on the turf course. 14 horses entered, but we'll note, I believe 6 of them are cross-entered in the race we just talked about, those being Tone Broke, My Boy Jack, Blended Citizen, Silver Dust, Captivating Moon, and Royland. So this field could scratch down to as many as 8 horses if the other one stays on the dirt. We'll see, or if this one stays on the turf. Mr. Misunderstood drew post number 14, and I went through all those horses that are cross-entered because don't view it as a big negative that he drew post 14 because there are likely to be a bunch of scratches out of this race. He is clearly the horse to beat, and I know we talked about him when we handicapped the River City handicap going back to November at Churchill Downs, and neither of us liked him a whole lot that day because his form in 2019 prior to that had been a little subpar compared to prior seasons, but he did run one of his better speed figures there and got the job done. Still, is he a horse that you totally trust to hold that form?
I don't. He could win this race, no doubt about it. And as just say, the 14 might throw a little people. He's not really going to be out that far for sure. The other horses that interest me that I think could win in here are one who's kind of become his rival is Space Mountain. They've changed changed position, taken turns beating each other a few times. I think they faced off about 4 times in recent times. So I don't see any reason Space Mountain couldn't turn the tables. I don't think he's quite as good as Silver Dust, but he does beat him when that one doesn't show up or get the best trip, and Space Mountain does. And he's going to be a much bigger price, obviously. So he is one that I would definitely consider using. And the other one is Captivating Moon, who is one of those horses that's cross-entered, but I personally have always thought he's a better horse on turf. We talked about him last time. That race did wind up coming off the turf, and he won anyway against, I think, Space Mountain ran second in that race. But he's a horse who I think is right up there with the favorite and with Space Mountain. So those are the 3 it came down to for me, and I'm going to look for the ones that offer most value. Well, if I play horizontals, I would probably use all 3 of them.
Now, speaking of that Diliberto Memorial Stakes that came off the turf, we had handicapped that race on the forecast, 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago when they ran that race. And I know that day we both had liked, assuming it was going to stay on the turf, we both had liked Parlor in that race off the Mike Maker claim. Now, obviously, Parlor's not a dirt horse, so they scratched him out of that race, and they're instead running now 4 weeks later in this spot. What do you make of Parlor's chances? Is this just a tougher spot for him, or should we still like him off the claim?
No, I do still like him some, maybe not quite as much as the others. I think this field stacks up maybe just a little bit tougher. I don't remember the exact circumstances in that field. I think there might have been more pace signed on that day, which is why I liked him a little bit more. But he certainly ran a big race last time. He got that big 121 TimeformUS speed figure, which could definitely win this race. And if he gets some pace to run into, I could see him winning this one.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that race because while I liked Parlor last time, and I think I agree with you that there was more pace in that race, looking at the way that this race is likely to shape up, assuming that we get the expected scratches, the horse that beat Parlor last time, Sailing Solo, actually interests me quite a bit in this race because I know it's just his last race speed figure that makes him competitive here, but he seems like a 5-year-old that's just really hit his best stride right now. And that number that he earned last time, that 122 TimeformUS speed figure, the race got a 97 buyer. So, I mean, both numbers seem to check out. It seems totally legitimate, and it's not like he got to walk on the lead that day. I mean, Parlor had every chance to get by him, and Sailing Solo just held that horse at bay and was really game coming down to the wire. I was looking at the also-rans coming out of that race. The 3rd place finisher, Majestic Pride, came back at another race and was 19-1 next time out, won that race, actually improved his TimeformUS speed figure, got a 115 next time out. So that allowance race that Sailing Solo won looks really legitimate to me, and there's not a ton of front-running speed in this race, especially once you consider that Silver Dust is coming out. He just has to deal with Factor This on the front end, and Factor This is not exactly a need-the-lead type of runner. So I'm kind of looking at Sailing Solo to maybe take these from gate to wire at a price.
Yeah, I could see that. In that race you mentioned, Clint Maroon actually was pretty far back in the field. He came back to run a decent 4th in a stakes race in late December, where he actually improved his speed figure quite a bit too. I think it was 7 or 8 points. So, it was a strong race, and I have no problem with that pick. It's definitely a deep competitive race, and you got to see what's going on at the window and kind of decide that way. But I certainly wouldn't be standing on 1 or 2 in here.
And I love my little pedigree geek out moments. I was looking at Sailing Solo's pedigree. It's funny. This was a Juddmonte bred horse that has like the most regal pedigree you're ever going to find. You might remember his dam Proviso, who was, I think she was like a 4-time Grade 1 winner back a few seasons ago. She won the Kilroe Mile, the Just a Game. She was, I think, in the running for a championship. But I guess Juddmonte sold this horse because he didn't show promise. But he's showing the promise now as a 5-year-old. So we'll see if he goes off at a price and can control on the front end in this race. Let's move on to Tampa Bay Downs, where they're running a couple of stakes for 3-year-olds. We'll talk about the one for 3-year-old fillies, the Gasparilla, going 7 furlongs, because drew a pretty big field, a lot of up-and-comers in this race, many horses coming off maiden victories, so comparisons can be a little difficult. One horse, though, that has a bit more experience that I think is going to take a lot of money is the number 3 Swiss Skydiver. I've just liked both of her starts. She hasn't gotten off from the gate well either time. She's broken slowly in both career races, but everything else she's done in those 2 races at Churchill Downs was pretty encouraging. And to me, she seems like the horse to beat.
Yeah, I agree. I actually did this race for Daily Racing Form. There's a preview of it out on the DRF TV webpage. So take a look if you get a chance out there. But I'm with you. I came back. There's a lot of pace in this race predicted by the pace projector. I totally agree with it. And that kind of made me against a couple of the horses who are going to take money in here. 260, I think, is a horse that absolutely has to have the lead. She wilts anytime she doesn't get it. And I don't see any way that's going to happen here. So she's one that's going to take money that I don't like. And then We the Clouds draws the inside, which I hate especially for a second-time starter at the 7 furlong distance. She doesn't have a whole lot of experience. There's going to be a quick pace. So she's another one I'm kind of tossing. And with that, I wound up landing on the two horses, or the horse you mentioned, Swiss Skydiver, and also her stablemate. I think both of them have a pretty good shot in here. Her stablemate, by the way, is Palace Miss. She doesn't quite have the speed figures of Swiss Skydiver, just a little bit below, but she's also turning back. And this is one of those, I'll give a shameless plug of the updated DRF formulator, where it's just so much easier for me and so much more useful to pull up the trainer stats and looked up Ken McPeak, and he really is good at turnbacks. His winning percentage is only a little better than the norm for him, but the ROI goes through the roof. So he knows what he's doing here. It's actually a profitable angle for him. So between the two, I think one of them will definitely win. I'm assuming since they have different riders named, they're both going to run. The reason I sided a little bit towards Palace Miss is just because of the value. She's 15-1 on the morning line compared to Swiss Skydiver, but I don't have any problem with either one of them. I think they're both sitting in a really good spot.
Yeah, I have no problem with Swiss Skydiver. To me, she's the horse to beat. The mile just seemed like it got to her last time. They were a little probably prematurely aggressive, moving up to take the lead by the time they got to the quarter pole in the slop at Churchill Downs that day, and it just kind of took its toll late. But I thought she ran exceptionally well for the first 7 furlongs of that race, and this race is 7 furlongs. As far as the rest of the field that goes, though, I saw this race a little differently. Maybe the pace is going to be really fast. It's hard for me to gauge it because all of these horses are so inexperienced, so you don't know exactly how they're going to ride them compared to how they did first time out. It might heat up on the front end. I really like, though, one of the recent debut winners, and that is the number 1, We the Clouds. Maybe the rail post won't be ideal for her, but I thought she showed a lot of professionalism first time out at Keeneland. She broke on top. They sort of reined her in and seemed like they almost intended to give her an education because Gabriel Saez placed her in behind horses coming around the far turn, forced her to alter course to the outside. And once he got her into the clear, I really loved the way she kicked for home that day. They came home really fast. It's the kind of race that's never going to get a really high TimeformUS speed figure because the early pace was slow, but she's not a need the lead type, so I don't care about that too much. She really finished strongly that day. And speaking of the new DRF formulator, I was looking up some stats in there for her trainer, Timothy Ham, and off debut wins with horses coming back that won first time out in their second career starts over the past 5 years. He's 9 for 19 with a 47% win rate, an ROI that's well over $2. And if you narrow that down to just debut winners making their second starts on the dirt, he's 7 for 11 with an ROI over $3. So he just has an exceptional record winning with horses that won their debuts. So I would expect We the Clouds to take a step forward, and hopefully she works out the right trip.
I do want to mention one other horse in here, and that's Faruka. This is a horse who debuted. She shows a 107 TimeformUS speed figure on the turf first out. Then she came and broke her maiden with a 97. I don't particularly like her in this spot, but the reason I want to mention her, I think that 107, even though I'm the guy that made it, is pretty suspect. It's a race I'm going to go back and review. The runbacks haven't been terrible from it, but nobody's quite lived up to what they ran that day. So I'm going to look at the specifics of that race and see if maybe I made a mistake there.
It's a good note. And she's a horse that anyway, regardless of the speed figure, is going to get that off a good turf race because I think, like you were alluding to, I didn't love her dirt maiden win either. And to me, she's not exactly competitive off that race. let's finish things up by talking about two races at Aqueduct, one from Saturday and one from Sunday. The higher class one is obviously the Saturday feature, the Toboggan, a Grade 3 event going 7 furlongs. And this race does feature last year's Grade 1 H. Allen Jerkins winner, Mind Control, who also won the 2018 Hopeful, another Grade 1 going the 7 furlong distance. Mind Control has not raced since that triumph last August where he beat the heavy favorite Chancelot. He definitely loves the distance, though. He's the class of this field. I almost forgot how fast he had run in some of those stakes races last year, especially the Bayshore, where he got an impressive TimeformUS speed figure. He's a really nice horse, and I admire him. I just don't love taking horses at short prices off layoffs like this.
Yeah, especially when you're not sure this is really a target for him. He's probably prepping towards a Carter, I would think. So I would imagine he's not fully cranked. I could be wrong, but I don't mind being wrong at short prices. I'd much rather be wrong, at a $15 or be right at a long price than wrong at a short price. This is a race the pace projector thinks is going to favor horses on or near the lead. There's not a whole lot of speed. I'm personally usually a little cautious with that at 7 furlongs because 7 furlongs is just tougher to wire than shorter sprints. The stats bear it out. The longer the race goes, the harder it is to wire the field, especially when you're talking about the same number of turns. So while I do give that a little weight, I don't put everything into it. I don't love anybody in here. There's some good horses. T Loves a Fight is coming back. I guess it was just a week ago, right? We just talked about
it was 7 days ago.
Right. So, but I'm not a big fan of that horse. The one horse who might catch my eye, depending on what he goes off at, is Still Having Fun. He's a horse who was pretty good early in the year. He won the Woody Stevens as a 3-year-old, and he just kind of really tailed off after that. They kept running him. He didn't do much at all. And then he finally was given a layoff. He came back as a first-time gelding. He showed up at Laurel against that tough group of sprinters we've talked about several times on both the Pacecast and the Forecast. And in a race won by Lewisfield, where he set a fairly slow pace with all the fractions coated in blue, he really was running late home and nearly got the Lewisfield late. So I was really impressed by him first time off that layoff. And any kind of improvement here, and if he gets any kind of pace to run into, I think he's a horse who has a real shot.
He's going to be a price in this race, and I'm not going to knock you off or talk you off a price. I mean, he wasn't a horse that I loved in this field, but I agree with your assessment of his last race. He did run well within the context of that race, given the flow. So have at it with him, because I think he's going to be every bit of that 10 or 12 to 1. I landed on American Anthem here as the alternative to Mind Control. As the morning line maker, I kind of would like to maybe take back my line a little bit because I feel like everybody likes this horse and he might even be the favorite in this race over Mind Control. There's a lot to like about American Anthem. You mentioned the pace projector. There's not a lot of speed in this field. And given the inside post position, I would imagine that Manny Franco is going to be pretty aggressive with him because he has done well from the front end in the past. So it seems like he's going to work out a decent trip. I think the real question with American Anthem is, do you trust him to get back to the form that he showed for Bob Baffert? He did disappoint in his only start for Rodolphe Brissett last time at Keeneland. And maybe you could say he's just not going to be the same horse since coming out of Bob Baffert's barn. About that Keeneland race, though, I will say he didn't get an ideal trip that day. He was just shuffled back in the early going, was too far back down the backstretch, got sent down to the rail in the straightaway, which I don't think was really where you wanted to be. All things considered, he just barely missed second. I don't think the race is quite as bad as it looks on paper, and his prior form just is going to make him really tough in here because he's really the only horse in this field that has a string of speed figures that make him as fast or faster than Mind Control. And now he's in Danny Gargan's barn. Danny Gargan is the kind of trainer that can work some miracles at times, so hoping he gets back into form.
Yeah, no problem with that. I was pretty sure you wouldn't be able to resist the Danny Gargan angle. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It certainly can pay dividends many times.
Yeah, and the others, I just think it depends on the trip. And even the horse you mentioned, Still Having Fun, it's going to depend on how the pace shapes up. I mentioned that, too, for a horse like Nicodemus, who certainly has the talent to be competitive in this race and potentially even win it. It just depends on if these closers are going to get enough pace to close into in here. Let's close things out by briefly talking about the ladies' handicap on Sunday at Aqueduct. It's the 7th race on their card. A test of stamina for the fillies and mares as they go the demanding 9-furlong distance over the Aqueduct main track. And I think we're going to have a pretty heavy favorite in this race in the number 7, Bolera. She's just been improving with almost every start. She didn't get to participate too back in the turn back the alarm when she lost the rider coming out of the gate. But in the 5 races that she's competed, she's never finished out of the exacta. She's coming off her career best effort when she won the Comely last time over the very promising Arifana. She's just the horse to beat.
She is, but I'm actually going to take a shot against her. I wish I could say with who, because I think it's after her, it's a fairly deep field, and a few of them caught my eye. I thought Lucky Move ran pretty well last time out. She's going to need to take a step forward for sure. We don't know much about Entropia. The one thing I can say for her is when she was in Argentina, her best races seemed to come on dirt. She didn't run very well on her couple tries on turf, so her debut here wasn't a disgrace when you consider that. So she wouldn't shock me, but the horse that's most interesting to me is Another Broad. I think you can just put a line right through her last race. It was one of those bad kickback days. She was in the back of the pack. She swung wide. It was that Spice Perfection race where she just absolutely crawled on the front end, running fractions that almost any horse in training could have kept up with for a while. So I really don't think she had much shot. I mean, I would have liked to seen her close a little bit better, but I'm willing to ignore that one. And if you get past that one, her speed figures are every bit as good as what Bolera's been running. And, I expect more of that kind of performance from her.
Yeah, she's a difficult call for me. In some ways, I like her a little bit more from a value standpoint than her stablemate Bolera, because she did earn that speed figure 2 back in the turn back the alarm that I think would even make Bolera hard-pressed to beat her. I don't know what to make of that turn back the alarm. As a trip handicapper, it's just kind of annoying to me. That's a race that we can't watch because there was an ugly incident at the start. So the decision's been made that no one has access to that replay anymore. Everyone was fine in the incident, it should be noted. But it was a race where Bolera didn't get to participate. Another horse didn't get to participate. Golden Award, who won, is really good. I just don't know what to make of it. She should Another Broad should appreciate getting back out around the 2 turns. So I do like her in this race. I ultimately wanted a bit of a better price, so I went in a different direction. My top pick is Our Supernova, and this is just a horse that I have to bet off her last trip. If you watch my Horses to Watch segment that I do every week on DRF TV, I highlighted this horse's trip in depth in the Bay Ridge last time. She was the 2-5 favorite that day, and one of my pet peeves is when riders try to get a little too cute riding a heavy favorite. And I think that's kind of what happened with Junior Alvarado, who has been riding great at this Aqueduct meet, but I think he'd like to have this ride back in the Bay Ridge because Our Supernova outbroke the field, almost beat the gate, came out of the gate about a length ahead of everybody else. And even though she has the speed to take the lead, they decided to rein her in, put her behind horses coming her into the first turn, and he just got locked in this pocket, could never get out, was in trouble for probably the last half mile of the race. I know she finished 4th out of 5 as a heavy favorite, but if you watch that race, she just never really had a chance to do any running. She's a lot better than that. All of her prior speed figures are superior. Now, you might say maybe she doesn't want to go the 1 1/8 distance because of that poor performance last time. I don't buy that because when you go back earlier in her career, she was a horse who actually improved a lot once they finally got her out around 2 turns. And I think her recent improvement is just due to the fact that she's a better horse for Charlton Baker and really improved in recent months rather than due to the fact that she wants to be a sprinter. So I think Our Supernova is going to show a lot more speed this time with the rider change to Jorge Vargas. And from a speed figure standpoint, she's not that far off the 2 favorites. She's going to be a better price. So I've got to take a shot with her.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention, you hear a lot of people talk with horses as they age and improve. It seems like there's a thought out there that as soon as horses turn 4, they're probably done for the most part. And that is, you've got them at their maximum. And I don't really think that's the case. A horse like Our Supernova at the age of 5 is probably just coming into her own. That seems to be the peak on the studies I've done. So just because a horse is 5 years old doesn't mean they can't improve, because it can and often does actually happen.
Yeah, and I think this race is a great example of that because the horses we just talked about most in depth, our Supernova and Another Broad, are both 5-year-olds who just seem to be in the best form of their careers right now. Unfortunately, with the colts and the full horses, we don't get to see them, or the top ones at least, racing this deep into their careers. But you kind of wish that we could because it seems like that's when a lot of them hit their peaks. So hopefully
we saw it with Gunrunner, if you remember. That was Gunrunner and California Chrome, for that matter, are probably the best recent examples I could think of. And, those are two guys who ran speed figures basically off our charts almost. So it does show if these horses stuck around a little bit longer, they could run some really eye-popping numbers. But you're not going to see that when they retire at the end of the 3-year-old season or beginning of the 4.
Yeah, and it's appropriate that we're talking about this on the week of the Pegasus World Cup, which is coming up in, I think, just about 8 days, because that's always been such a teaser the past few years, because it seems like the horses that have won this Pegasus World Cup are just hitting their peaks. Gunrunner, City of Light, and this year Omaha Beach, and we don't see them after the race, which is kind of unfortunate because all of these horses would have had big years if they had continued running. It just doesn't happen anymore. So going back to the race that we talked about, hopefully we gave out some good handicapping ideas. Hopefully some of the long shots actually run for us this week. We'll, of course, recap all of these races when we come back on Tuesday to do the TimeformUS Pacecast. And speaking of that, you can, of course, listen to all of our podcasts on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form. You can check out all of this content. So thanks for listening this week, and we'll talk to you again on Tuesday.